Good morning. Today is New Year's Eve, and Happy New Year, because you probably won't hear from me after this. Today we are in the local vigilance area. First time out in 2 weeks. For those of you that are aware, I had a mild mishap 2 weeks ago, been recovering from it, and today, if nothing else happens, I'm going to tell that story. So we have that. Maybe some thoughts on New Year's resolutions about a couple of things, if nothing else. We've got some stuff to cover. And hope everybody has a great New Year's otherwise, and we're going to get moving. Thanks. Okay, so what happened 2 weeks ago? This is a cautionary tale of a person who is hiking in woods they're fairly familiar with, well, very familiar with, and they've hiked it dozens of times. And therefore, comfort gives way to, dare I say, overconfidence, and you make some shortcuts that, had I been in different areas that I know less, I probably would not have done. So this is one of those where I kind of have to take responsibility for my own foolishness and maybe arrogance. So the conditions today were, I decided to go out for a short hike because the weather was fairly miserable. It was about 34 degrees and slow drizzle. I brought the gear that I needed, but because I thought I'd only be out for a 30-minute hike, maybe a little more, I left a lot of it at the car because, again, I've hiked this for dozens of times. So what possibly could go wrong? So I do the plan as intended for the first part of the hike, and I get to a point where I've been wondering in this local area where the moose population's gone, because in past years I've seen more tracks. You see there's shit everywhere, but you don't so you don't see tracks in the area that we're in now as much. But down the hill they're logging, so my theory being that the logging's kind of moved them to another area. It's a big enough area that's possible. So I happened upon some moose tracks and I found the telltale leavings. I started following that off the trail into the hinterlands, started bushwhacking more or less, and figured I would follow it for a bit, but I got intrigued, so go a little bit further, question it again, go a little bit further. I did that like 3 or 4 times, to a point where I am, at my best guess, 25 minutes from the logging road I started out on. That was my first mistake. So I decided to go back, but by then I was fairly wet. Now, the one thing I did right was I was wearing fleece material that is good at retaining warmth in spite of being soaking wet. That helped. Had I opted for other weather, I might have been in more trouble, but I went with the warmer stuff, and so that part I did right. So I start heading back, and at the 25-minute mark, there's no road. My second mistake at that point, I should have pulled out my compass or phone and Google Maps or something to orient where I was. And for the grammar Nazis out there, I don't say orientate because that is a British corruption of proper grammar. Simon Hicks can get over my statement. A friend of mine from YouTube, or from Facebook, anyone out wondering. But 25 minutes becomes 30, becomes 45. Still no road, so I decide, tree break, that I'm going to finally get out my compass and do that. My third mistake, I pulled out the crappy compass that I bought with one of those shitty little $20 or $12 survival kits you get on Amazon. Compasses, as I understand it, are supposed to point north. That's their entire logic. As opposed to kind of sort of pointing northeast when they want to. So as an aside, as soon as I got home, that went in the trash. Only to find out after the fact, fourth mistake, I had the good one with me the entire time, but hadn't bothered to check. So I get to a point where it's now the past the hour mark, the 90-minute mark. I'm working between my shitty compass and my phone and Google Maps, but being aware of the temperature and the battery life on my phone, should things go further south, as the story will later reveal. And still no road. And Google Maps, although not very useful for forest navigation per se, does give you a general indication over time of where you are and the fact I wasn't going in the right direction. So I made a point at one point to best guess where I was and head east, or what I thought was east, because there's a parallel running trail that in theory I would hit at some point, and then I could walk it back from a known waypoint. But I wasn't initially finding that either, so I got to a point at about 90 minutes where A, I'm soaking wet, B, the temperature's going down, and C, there's snow that's going to come in. So you're kind of at a point where anybody with sense at this point needs to make a call. So I call my better half, and I advise her, still being stupid, if you haven't heard from me in 30 minutes, call the state police and report me missing, because I'm pretty sure I'm lost. And she kindly offered, "Okay, you want me to call them now?" And due to her kindness and thoughtfulness, largely why she's my better half, she wins out. I'm like, "Yeah, call them now." So she calls the state police. She calls back about 5 minutes later, and this was my first insight into local search and rescue and how it works, because she said, call 911 directly, because once you do that, they can lock into the GPS on your phone. Which actually makes sense, because I've had similar experience from 20 years ago when I had the first and shittiest, earliest example of a smartphone. And the technology was actually available 20 years ago, so that actually made sense. So I did that, and then I contacted the lady from 911, and I had an embarrassing conversation where do you have a tarp? Do you have food? Do you have water? Like, yeah, back of the car, because I was a moron. Embarrassing conversation, because she's like, well, what's your outdoors experience? I'm like, well, other than today, it's actually not bad. Which I still like to believe, but we have those humbling moments, don't we? And yes, today I do actually know where I am and where I'm going. Again, orientating from here, I'm not going to go that way, because that is going to take me nowhere. That would eventually bring me down the hill to the trail that runs along down the hill parallel. That's the way back. And I would eventually hook onto a trail that would take me that way down the hill if I went that way. but through a bunch of thorns, so we're obviously not going to do that because I had my fill of thorns the last time because my right arm is still recovering from the chewed up nature of what happened the first time. So as I'm talking to her, I pop out on what I believe at the time to be the parallel trail I was looking for. It turns out, as I'm walking along and expecting certain landmarks, not seeing them, that it's not the same trail. So there are two other trails in the general neighborhood, so I'm trying to find some point of familiarity where the where the trail, what trail this is. And for the longest time, I can't. I mean, it looks vaguely familiar, and I start going in the wrong direction, and then my gut, for the first time all day, correctly tells me, I think you're going the wrong way. So I make an executive decision, which proved correct, and I turned around and went back the way I thought I should go. Which further reinforced the theory I thought I was on the trail I originally thought I was looking for, but was still wrong, because it started looking similar but not exact. And at one point after the search had begun, I thought I had heard and a point of contention with the searchers, just with no due respect, because they have my utmost appreciation that they came out as quickly as they did for a small town volunteer fire department and resident state trooper and all that. They got there fairly quickly. I can't badmouth their effort at all, other than they kept telling me, stay still, stay still, stay still. But I'm like, if I stay still, I'm now sufficiently wet. I start to get wet. I mean, I'm already soaking wet, so I get cold, hypothermia. If I keep moving, if only pacing until you get here, then, because right now, if I were to walk to my car, I have absolutely no idea how long it's going to take me. Google Maps is guesstimating where my car is and telling me it's an hour and 24 minutes. Which is an indication to me that I've covered a fair amount of ground, which I discovered was actually the case after a while. So I thought after the search was ongoing that I heard someone yelling in the distance, so I yelled to them, and I got to yell back. So I started moving towards them, assuming they were one of the ATV guys out looking for me. Figuring they'd be on the trail and we'd meet up at some point. So I go about, I'm going to estimate 250, 300 yards down the trail. I don't find them, but at this point I find salvation because I turn to my left and there is a familiar green metal roof from an established lean-to that I've hiked past a million times. So I know where I am now, but here's the revelation. Hillendale, I had gone down, I'd basically gone through shit like this, easily a mile and a half in the course of an hour. I don't know how good that is making time-wise, considering I have to go down hills and slippery leaves and things like this, but I was heading into Massachusetts and was already on the Massachusetts side. And I had lost the signal with my searchers, and so now I'm like, I got to walk back to a point where I can communicate that I know more or less where I am and arrange a spot to meet them and get picked up. We are now at the 2.5 hour mark. But the fact is I'm now feeling better about it because at least I know where I am, and I know I have a long walk back to my car, but I know how to do it. The not knowing part. If you've ever seen an episode of Survivor Man where he describes the sense of rising panic, I only had that for maybe 5-10 minutes, but it is a very true statement. And it's not a pleasant feeling. When you're in an area that you think you know and you're looking around and it all looks the same. And you have that moment when you realize that you really don't know what to do, what direction to go in. as my lovely video is interrupted by the plane flying over with lovely plane noise, but regardless. Hardly an annoyance based on 2 weeks ago. It's a feeling that is, I'll be very generous and say unpleasant. Luckily, like I said, only for like 10 minutes, then I was talking to somebody. So you at least had that factor. I could go into other psychological moments in my life where I didn't have that luxury, but we're not going to do that now. So, mainly due to a fact I'd rather not lose composure. In fact, give me a minute. Okay. So I got a long walk. I had to walk up a dirt road, but I mean cover to get back to a connector trail I knew would get me back to where the road I was originally on, and then get back to the car was probably a good 40-minute walk, maybe a little less. But after you've been out in the cold and the wet for 2.5 hours, that's a long walk. But at least, like you said, there's that distant light at the end of the tunnel, and you know you can trust it. The feeling otherwise, not so much. So I get to the connector trail. I'm about halfway up when I get the signal back, and the state trooper calls me. And it's at this point that we arranged to meet up at the top of the trail. There's a junction between the one road and the trail. And he's like, we've been looking for him. I'm like, yeah, I know. I lost the signal, so I couldn't communicate with you, so I needed to find a place. And then I made the hypothermia argument with him, and then he backed off of scolding me because he was a little irritated I wasn't holding still. But he conceded my point, and we, after a short period of time, we kind of found each other. There were 2 volunteer fire trucks, a state trooper, and there might have been a third vehicle. I'm not sure who they were. Maybe another volley. But when they found me, they weren't condescending. They were nice. They were understanding. The trooper was not lecturing or nasty about it. He was nice about it. At that point, I just like, okay, I'm cold, I'm wet, I'm done with the rain. One of them, interestingly enough, asked me, can we persuade you to take a ride back to the car? And I'm like, not a hard sell. Because one guy after that's like, I have heat. I'm like, sold. I'm good. Because I was still probably, based on Google estimates, probably a good 45-minute walk to my car. I had covered a surprising amount of ground. And there's a reason why I decided to take the long way back, because 1, I knew that, and 2, going back the way that I knew otherwise, sort of, would have been uphill and through all the brambly shit that I'd come down in. And I had already kind of taken some damage, so long story short, 3 hours and change later, they got me back to my car with much thanks, and they have my appreciation for a long time. Never did get the guy's name, but to the guy with the heat, thank you profoundly for not making me walk those last 45 minutes, because they would have sucked. I was already cold and borderline shivering. Which, if anyone has had mild hypothermia before, this is not the most pleasant thing you'll ever go through. It's actually very easy to underestimate and therefore incredibly dangerous. Because a little further down the road from that, maybe within 30 minutes, you are in a medical state where basically the reason you're shivering uncontrollably is because your body is trying desperately to combat the cold. So they're taking the blood out of your extremities and putting it into your core to protect your core. So there's a point where your extremities, your dexterity is going to be shit. So you're trying to get back in your car, you finally get there, and your hands barely work. You can only imagine the fun that is. So on to the damage. Along my shin, have a nice little deep cut on my arm. On my right, I got chewed up minor scratches and things like that. My elbow on my right, I had managed to fall and I popped my bursa, which is a sac of fluid at the tip of your elbow, and caused a minor infection, which I've been fighting for the last week with antibiotics, which is now turning the corner too. But all in all, again, this is a cautionary tale of don't get cocky, and now we move to the portion where, well, what did you learn from this? Number one, every so often, like on a monthly basis, if nothing else, check your effing pack and make sure that what you think is in there is actually in there. Don't assume and don't get there, because there's actually been more than one time, too, where I've not brought the drone for a week or two where I thought it was charged, and in actuality it was on like 1.5 bars. So you're at a scene, you could have taken a much better intro or whatever for your video, and you ain't got no juice. So good luck with that. Number one. Number two, if I were to slip and fall in here and like crack my kneecap or something, I am as screwed as anywhere else. So leave your ego at the door. Not that I was overly egotistical, but I would say that I was lazy in some woodsmanly ways where I could have been more attentive to things, but I wasn't. And everybody, if you hike long enough, will have that story that you have to tell. I guess this one is mine, which is now a matter of the public record with hopefully what comes off as some honest humility, because yes, it was my fault. Yes, I take responsibility for it, and yes, had I to do it again, I clearly would have made much different choices. I would have brought my coat, which is, although I probably would have been sweating a little bit, I could have opened it up, but I would have been a lot more rain resistant. Although that arguably could have been like one evil versus another, but because sweat in the cold works against you too, because then your core is already wet and cold. People I know have paid for that. I haven't, because I've usually known that one, but that is a thing. So we are going to take a segment break now that I got that out of my system, and I am going to cover some ground towards the way back and have a look at a different area up here, which so far today is, if I were to stop talking and shut up, you could hear a pin drop. There's one trailhead one way in. I'm the only one at the trailhead. There's, to my knowledge, no hunters here, so I am wearing a sort of orange, but they're not here. And today in Connecticut is the last day of deer season, so if you haven't got your trophy buck and you're not a poacher, you're SOL until April. And then you have like it's a compressed half-day season. They don't do a full season here for whatever reason. I've never fully understood Connecticut's hunting law logic, but, you know, it is what it is. Excuse me. But that's why I also, as a rule, get a Vermont and a Connecticut fishing license once a year, because they're a little bit easier to deal with, and they handle their outdoorsiness up in Vermont better. So, and I also know more places to fish up there. So if you're watching this and you're not a Bigfooter and you actually want to ever go fishing sometime, and you live up that way, feel free to hit me up. But I'm going to take a segment break at this point and stop yapping and kind of cover some ground. Thanks for listening.